Hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you today on behalf of Irish Studies Würzburg to our second guest lecture with an Irish American focus this semester. So, welcome to all of you, and especially to our guest lecturer, Kate Costello-Sullivan. Kate is professor of modern Irish literature at Moyne College in Syracuse in New York, and she was recently named the inaugural Mary A. Carroll Endowed Professor in Arts and Sciences. So congratulations, Kate. Professor Costello-Sullivan has published widely on 19th and 21st century Irish fiction. Her monographs are Mother Country, Politics of the Personal in the Fiction of Colm Tóibín, which was published in 2012, and Trauma and Recovery in the 21st Century Irish Novel, published in 2018. She has also edited critical editions of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla and Nora Hall's Poor Women. Most recently, in 2024, she co-edited a collection with Cian McMahon on the history of Irish America for Routledge. She's a current editor of Syracuse University Press's prestigious Irish series. And among other things, as you can tell from her brief bio sketch, Professor Costello-Sullivan is an or even the expert on Colm Tóibín. So in her guest lecture for Irish Studies Würzburg today, she will focus on his novel Long Island, which was published in 2024, and which is a sequel to his bestseller Brooklyn, published in 2009. The title of Professor Costello-Sullivan's lecture today is It Would Make You Independent: Immigration, Regret, and Women's Agency in Colm Tóibín's Long Island. So, Kate, we are delighted that you are joining us today, especially at such an early hour for you. And we are very much looking forward to your talk. Kate, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Great, Ina, thank you so much. And thanks, everybody, for coming out. I, of course, want to extend my thanks to Irish Studies Würzburg and to Drs. Bergman and Eisenman, and to Felicia, Crisela, and Nicola for your help in setting this up. So thanks very much. I will talk for 35 minutes, 40 at the outside. No one, as I said earlier, has ever complained you spoke too briefly. And then I look forward to your comments and questions. Okay. So I'll give a brief reminder of what happens in the books too, just because that's what we do. Okay. So Colm Tóibín's 2024 novel Long Island, a sequel to his earlier 2009 work Brooklyn, picks up, and I'm going to pronounce it Eilish. I know you can do it Eilish or Eilish, but I'm going to just say Eilis, picks up with Eilis Lacey Fiorello, now a mother and a betrayed wife, as she uncannily recreates her return to Ireland 20 years after her first sojourn back from America. Long Island re-engages the thorny issues of immigration and Irish identity that are raised in Brooklyn, such as the roles of silence and home. It tantalizingly suggests that Eilis can undo the consequences of her move from Ireland. However, the novel goes on to consider another lingering factor: the specific cultural and financial constraints on women that hampered their agency and opportunities for self-fulfillment. So this talk is going to examine the ways in which Long Island re-engages with the social construction of Irish women, exploring not only the cultural factors like silence that condition their choices, but as importantly, the pervasive financial limitations that affected women throughout the 20th century. So just as a reminder, in Brooklyn, we met Eilis Lacey, whose family has decided to send her to Brooklyn, New York, with the help of an Irish priest because of a dearth of jobs, especially for women, in 1950s Ireland. Eilis lives in a boarding house in America with other Irish women and begins dating an Italian-American man, Tony Fiorello. When her sister Rose dies unexpectedly, Eilis returns to Ireland and slides comfortably into the role of daughter of the house, with the added glamour of a returned Yank. As her visit lengthens, she finds herself effectively dating a local man, Jim Farrell, who even takes her to her best friend Nancy's wedding. When a nosy town shopkeeper, a cousin to her landlady in Brooklyn, threatens to tell everyone of her marriage to Tony, however, Eilis returns to Brooklyn. Now, Long Island, as you know, picks up this narrative 20 years on. Eilis Fiorello is now a mother of two and still married to Tony, who continues to work as a plumber. They live in a compound of houses they share with his extended family in fulfillment of the vision that Tony had described to Eilis in Brooklyn. Within pages of the novel, we learn that Tony has had an affair and impregnated a customer. That woman's Irish husband insists he will leave the baby on Eilis's doorstep once it is born. Eilis informs Tony that she will not take this baby in and comes to learn from her brother-in-law Frank that Tony's mother nonetheless secretly plans to take in the child whom Tony will then adopt. As a result, and as her own mother's 80th birthday draws nigh, Eilis decides to return to Ireland, unclear on whether she will return. Once in Ireland, Eilis slowly readapts to the rhythms of life in Enniscorthy. She reconnects with Nancy, now a widow and, unbeknownst to Eilis, secretly engaged to Jim Farrell, who never married. When Eilis and Jim encounter one another, they quickly reconnect romantically, and Jim starts planning a life with Eilis. When Nancy spies them together, however, she publicly announces their engagement. The novel ends, as you know, without explicit resolution, but implies that Eilis, for her part, will return to Long Island, although to what end is unclear, while Jim will play out the engagement to Nancy, at least for now. Now, readers of Brooklyn will remember that the earlier novel focuses centrally on what Jose Carregal Romero has called, quote, a protagonist whose experiences are shaped by a personal history of silence and self-suppression. Unable to voice her desire to stay in Enniscorthy and powerless to derail the combined forces of family and religion in play, Eilis surrenders to the pressures to immigrate. As she notes of her family, quote, they knew so much, each one of them, that they could do everything except say out loud what it was they were thinking. Through her inability to express herself, Tóibín signals a subdued awareness that 1950s Enniscorthy is a simpler but also less liberal time, with Ireland's painful retreat from silence and secrecy yet distantly on the horizon. Now, the role of silence in Tóibín's work is, of course, well known. As Carregal Romero observes, the silences of Tóibín's characters usually foreground social restrictions and challenges. It is thus unsurprising that Long Island is consistent with the author's canonical tendency to represent 20th century Irish people as hailing from what Maureen Corrigan describes as, quote, a world where nobody would ever dare say a word. Eilis is still recognizable in the quietness of her personality and the tendency toward interiority in the second novel. Thus, when she learns of Tony's affair, her ruminations display some of the passivity and dependence on others which we saw in the earlier novel. Quote, if she told someone about it, then she might know how to feel, what she should do. All through her childhood, in even the smallest crisis, she could appeal to Rose. There must be some number she could call. She held the receiver to her ear and realized there was not. There was no one she could tell. Eilis is thus still the reticent character whom we met in Brooklyn. Despite this consistency, however, Eilis has evolved, as people and characters do, which invites the possibility that her time in America, as much as natural maturity, has changed her. In an interview with America Magazine, Tóibín acknowledged, quote, she's become less hesitant as time goes on. Although Eilis has moments of passive-aggressive behavior, for example, spilling stew rather than saying she is angry, or of maintaining silence instead of engaging difficult questions, middle-aged Eilis will speak up for herself. When her father-in-law objects to her stance on Vietnam, for example, Eilis not only asserts her right to have an opinion, quote, I am as American as you are. She also refuses to back down, quote, she looked directly at her father-in-law, forcing him to avert his eyes. More importantly, when Tony's family connives to bring his out-of-wedlock child into the fold, she explicitly defends her right to have a say, arguing that the baby, quote, will not be a member of her family, and telling her mother-in-law, quote, leave the children out of this. How they feel is none of your business. Finally, in an ironic echo of Brooklyn, where Eilis agrees to marry Tony to reassure him that she will return after Rose's funeral, Eilis refuses to promise that she will go back to Long Island without a guarantee that her wishes will be respected, and she sticks to this demand. Again, as Carregal Romero observes, quote, if in Brooklyn, Eilis silently accepts the decisions others make for her, in Long Island, she reclaims her agency from the very beginning of the novel. Now, the combination of Eilis's ongoing inclinations toward repression and self-expression reflects Long Island's suggestion that immigration and the negotiation of place are lifelong experiences. I have suggested elsewhere that Brooklyn explores, quote, the permeability of cultural space, as well as an individual's palimpsestic placement in relation to identity, culture, and history. Eilis's behavior reflects that negotiation in this novel as well, as she has brought what she learned in Enniscorthy with her to New York, while also adapting to life in America. Her role as an immigrant and the consequent cultural mediation that requires are highlighted through her recurrent positioning in the novel as an outsider. Despite being a member of the Fiorello family and an American resident for literally decades, for example, Eilis is held apart. She notes that her in-laws, quote, blamed her interest in privacy and staying apart as something Irish, and they act as if seriousness were an inherently Irish trait. The family gossips among themselves, often excluding Eilis, as is most evident in their shared news of Tony's philandering and making plans for his daughter despite her wishes. Eilis recognizes her own exclusion, noting that it is, quote, strange how little they all knew about her. Of course, the fact that her father-in-law challenges her right to have a say in American politics, as we have seen, implies that she does not truly belong. Yet when Eilis returns to Ireland, she is not seamlessly embraced as a returned child of Enniscorthy either. Even as he is drawn toward her, for example, Jim thinks that, quote, Eilis might be the one person he could confide in because she was an outsider. And her mother frets that, quote, the whole town will be looking at what Eilis wears, implicitly expecting her to be glamorous as a returned Yank. Neither fully considered American nor entirely accepted as Irish any longer, Eilis feels at home in both and neither space simultaneously. This illustrates what Eve Walsh Stoddard had observed of Brooklyn, quote, that it inscribes conflicting and ultimately indeterminate debates over the nature and location of home and Irishness for migrants who leave and then return to Ireland. Indeed, in Long Island, too, this kind of cultural, dislocation is reflected explicitly in the slipperiness of the word home. In New York, when the cuckolded husband knocks on Eilis's door, his stance, quote, as though waiting to be challenged, reminded her of home. And she recognizes the, quote, at home, no man would be able to take a newborn baby and deliver it to another household. Here, clearly, home means Ireland. Yet when Eilis returns to Enniscorthy, she thinks that, quote, what she most wished for was that she were not in her mother's living room, but rather at home, waking to the soft light of early summer through the curtains of her bedroom on Long Island. Here, home means America. Thinking about this conundrum, Eilis avers that, quote, no one really knew anything about her. Quote, Tony did not even know Jim existed. Enniscorthy townspeople did not have to explain themselves. They did not have different accents, which they used when they met different people. Suddenly, Eilis imagined Tony like a ghost, walking up the side aisle searching for her. Tony would know no one. He would be an outsider, and he might get a sense of how she had felt in all her years away from home. And I'll mention, too, with that reference to everyone will be talking, that reference to ghost, Tóibín is notorious for intertextual references within his own canon. It's like a cookie for his readers, that if you know his work, you'll pick up on these little things. So I'm happy to talk about some of the ways that this text is consistent with that canonical tendency, if you want to talk about that later. So, as is often the case for immigrants, Eilis is thus marked not only by the cultural tendencies of her place of origin, but also by the in-betweenness of her cultural identity as an immigrant. Her increased forcefulness and lingering reticence reflect the dual or dueling pressures of place. If much of Brooklyn concentrates on Eilis's sense of powerlessness because of her cultural emplacement, from her initial inability to object to her immigration all the way through to the ultimate decision to return to Tony being effectively made for her by Mrs. Kelly, Long Island diverges. It offers the tantalizing possibility that Eilis may in fact be able to effect what amounts to a do-over. Because we have seen the course that Eilis's life has taken since Brooklyn, Long Island is centrally concerned with the decisions that its characters have made, and it is thus arguably haunted by the earlier novel. As a result, Long Island explicitly makes space for characters' consideration of alternate possibilities. Throughout Long Island, Eilis is repeatedly confronted with the consequences of her departure. Her mother, whom she has not seen, remember, in 20 years, clearly holds a grudge. She bitterly informs Eilis that she has disinherited her. Quote, "I thought I would let you know that your brother bought the house so that you don't expect a share when I've passed on to my reward." Mrs. Lacey also makes clear that she, quote, "does not want to hear about Eilis's life in America." Eilis's response is telling. When she imagines appealing to her siblings for advice, she thinks, quote, "they could easily reply that it was her own fault for staying away so long." Her ruminations that they could say it was her own fault suggests that Eilis indicts her own decisions and emigration as causal. Now, since Eilis is naturally questioning her life choices, given Tony's affair, her return to Enniscorthy thus presents an ironic counterpoint to her earlier homecoming in Brooklyn, which gave Eilis a tantalizing taste of what it would mean to undo the then recent decision to emigrate by stepping into Rose's old job, hanging out with her mother and her best friend Nancy, and starting to date Jim. In the proposition that Jim and Eilis might wind up together after all, Long Island provocatively asks whether regretted decisions can be undone. If it is, in short, ever too late to go home again. Thus, when Eilis attends Nancy's daughter's wedding, again presenting an ironic, uncanny echo of Brooklyn, where she attended Nancy's wedding to George while on her another unexpected visit home, Eilis links the alternate options today to her decision to return to Tony 20 years ago. Quote, "George Sheridan was so solid and decent, and now he was absent. Perhaps most people in the congregation had become used to that, but for Eilis, his death felt sudden and immediate. The image of Jim walking away from her in Cush had stayed with her. If he had glanced behind, he would have seen her standing in the lane. She went over in her mind what she would have wanted then. She imagined them both sitting, and then him asking her quietly what it had been like, being away all those years." Eilis regrets the alternate timeline that would have had her home in Enniscorthy to mourn George. The use of the conditional here, what she would have wanted, also highlights that Eilis is wistfully imagining other scenarios that could have been. Eilis's affair with Jim is explicitly configured not only as a remedy for regret, but as a kind of revision to her decisions around emigrating, as her newfound decisiveness and perhaps American-born independence convey. Yet this is not only a question of romantic decisions, and Jim and Eilis's decisions cannot occur in a cultural vacuum. Long Island reinforces not only the enduring power of sociocultural factors like silence, but also the wider financial and gendered realities at play for women. In his analysis of sexuality and Catholicism in 20th century Irish literature, Michael G. Cronin notes the need to contextualize the workings of silence in Irish society within its broader capitalist contexts. Thus, while it is certainly true that silence has sociocultural dimensions, some of which we have examined here, Cronin argues that these cannot be separated from the workings of, quote, a specific distinctive Irish permutation within a wider capitalist modernity. As a result, despite Long Island's teasing promise that Eilis might circumvent her past and her social emplacement, both cultural and financial factors unavoidably condition the life she seeks to lead. Not only subject to the cultural silences that are so prevalent in Tóibín's canon, Eilis also must confront the fiscal realities that limited and delimited 20th century Irish women's lives. First, though, Enniscorthy in Long Island is still the same Enniscorthy, a place described as watchful and stifling, where gossip, never-ending, omnipresent, relentlessly works away. We are reminded of the scandal it caused when, quote, it was clear to everyone how much in love Eilis and Jim Farrell were, only for Eilis to return without warning to America in the earlier novel. Jim recalls that rumors spread and that, quote, Miss Kelly had threatened to tell the whole town that Eilis was married. Eilis's behavior and subsequent return to Brooklyn scandalized her neighbors, not only because she, quote, came home all rigged out like an American, but because she was, quote, married to an Italian, if you don't mind, and, quote, her benighted mother didn't even know. You can tell that that's Mrs. Kelly from the tone. This reifies Emily Pine's contention that, quote, returnees disrupt their communities and cause themselves further dislocation. 20 years on, and as consenting adults, Jim and Nancy also still fear the judgmental eye of their neighbors. Nancy and Jim, quote, had never appeared in public together, and Nancy recognizes that while, quote, it was strange for two people in their mid-40s to behave like furtive teenagers, she still would sneak out of his house with him checking beforehand that there was no one in the street. Enniscorthy remains a stifling place. As a married woman who has already caused scandal once and is standing in an ambiguous cultural space, Eilis has even more reason for caution. When she sees Jim Farrell, she is, quote, tempted to move toward him, but she realized how closely they would be watched. In her attempts to contact him, Eilis recognizes that she was, quote, worrying too much about being discovered, but still she considered sneaking out of the house to phone him, and she warns him, quote, how hard it might be to find an excuse to leave because her mother watches everything. Despite the voice she found in Long Island then, Eilis is encumbered by the norms and expectations of place, reflecting again the durance of those social mores. Now, ultimately, it is that same small town watchfulness which brings back the reality of their situation to Eilis and Jim, as it enables Nancy to piece together Jim's infidelity. A slew of clues from nosy neighbors and reticent coworkers respectively draws the map. Quote, Lily Devereaux, whom you may know from the Blackwater Lightship, had told her about Jim appearing on a lane in Cush. It had seemed puzzling at the time, and she wondered if Lily's mother had mixed him up with someone else. But it occurred to her also that the day Jim was in Dublin, Eilis was, by coincidence, in Dublin as well. And now Eilis was in Cush, which she learned from Larry, and Jim was not where he usually was, which she learned from Shane. After seeing Jim and Eilis together, Nancy decides to announce their engagement, basically harnessing the power of her town's watchful nature and weaponizing it against both Eilis and Jim. Quote, Jim saw there was an appeal in her voice and a sort of desperation in how she looked at him. She must somehow have found out about Eilis. And it seemed to him that she wanted him to know that. The engagement ring was for Eilis Lacey to hear about. Once the entire town knows of Jim's engagement, he feels pressured to honor it. And ironically, it is the lack of silence here that undoes Jim and Eilis's attempt to start again. In this case, Nancy has exploited the power of those cultural silences for her own benefit. For her part, when Eilis learns of Jim's duplicity, it recreates for her the betrayal she experienced with Tony and pushes her back toward a posture of silence. Jim's final question to Eilis, quote, if the phone rang in your garage on Long Island one morning and it was me, and I was in New York or was even closer, and I had come to see you, what would you do? bespeaks not only Jim's sense of entrapment and his continuing regret over and resistance to the decisions that have led them here. Eilish's silence and his subsequent imagining of her as, quote, no one at all, just an empty space, metaphorically reinscribes the absence that Eilish has represented in Enniscorthy and his life for the past 20 years. Eilish's subsequent relapse into silence suggests that despite her determination to speak for herself and to claim her agency, she has been trumped by the cultural forces that frame and contain her. Another ironic parallel to the disempowering conclusion of Brooklyn. Despite that overview, as Cronin's assertion above suggests, cultural silence does not occur in a vacuum. Rather, it is imbricated with other social and cultural forces that delimit the characters' lives. Foundational to Eilish's emigration was the reality of fiscal or financial exigency. As Alan McWilliams has observed, Brooklyn was fundamentally in conversation with the tension between, quote, the draw of the secure but limited options at home in an economically depressed 1950s Ireland and the uncertain promise of America. Unlike Rose, who remained single and enjoyed a life of new clothes, golf, and independence, Eilish was, quote, unwittingly made a poor relation, granted gifts of hand-me-down cardigans and lipstick. The very fact of her emigration speaks to her financial exposure. The need to emigrate was often considered a reflection of financial vulnerability and sometimes shame. Thus, the workings of cultural repression and silence cannot easily be extricated here from the specific financial situations that both Nancy and Eilish negotiate in their respective courtship of Jim. This proves to be as important a determinant in how Long Island resolves. The Eilish who returns to Enniscorthy in Long Island has seemingly both means and opportunity. As in Brooklyn, where Eilish, upon her return, stood out for her glamour, Eilish's clothes are perceived as, quote, brighter, purer, more glamorous upon her return in Long Island. Additionally, Eilish throws her financial weight around as a returned emigre, ordering her mother a new fridge, washing machine, and cooker without even consulting her. Eilish's financial flex, if you will, like her expressiveness and flirtation with a life with Jim, suggests an attempt to undo the prior history of decisions made in Brooklyn. Yet despite the appearance that she has returned with wealth, a direct counter to the forces that drove her unwilling immigration in the first place, the novel makes clear that Eilish still labors under the same kinds of financial restraints which set her in opposition to Nancy. Thus, we learn that the money Eilish used to purchase household appliances for her mother was not her money, but rather they were funds given to her by her brother-in-law, Frank. Quote, my grandfather went back to Italy once. They presumed he had come home loaded. I thought it would be best for you to have some money in case you need it. In the same way, although Eilish looks to a possible new beginning with Jim, she recognizes that there are what she calls complications, including the reality of potential divorce proceedings and her need to avoid the appearance of adultery. If Eilish wants to assert her agency and make her own choices, then she still must navigate not only her children's feelings and the Irish sociocultural limitations on self-expression, but also the possibility of a, quote, divorce settlement, her reputation in Enniscorthy, and the complications of her life in Long Island. Indeed, it is only because her brother Jack offers to buy her a house, quote, to make her independent, that Eilish is even able to consider a life with Jim. Only after that conversation does Eilish tell Jim that she wishes to leave Tony and is sure about her decisions. It is these financial realities, as much as her sociocultural inheritance of silence and repression, that stay Eilish's hand, reifying Cronin's assertion that issues like sexuality and repression were, quote, not regulated through silence alone, but through a complex polyvalent field of discourses and contesting epistemologies. For Nancy's part, readers of Tóibín's 2007 short story collection, Mothers and Sons, would know from the story The Name of the Game that Nancy's husband, George Sheridan, left her in financial distress when he died. And this is a quote from The Name of the Game. Quote, He had told her bluntly that they had no money. He had mortgaged the shop, the living quarters, and the store beside it. This financial precarity is repeatedly invoked in Long Island as Nancy is challenged for the, quote, low tone she was bringing to Market Square through her chip shop. Her fantasies in imagining marriage to Jim often circulate on financial circumstances. For example, she ruminates on how different her life would be had she not lost George, or if she were to remarry. Quote, if only George had not died, there would not be a belligerent crowd outside her chip shop in Market Square. What would it be like when she was married again, when Jim would have finished by 1 o'clock on Sunday morning? What would it be like for him and for her? These ruminations quickly give way to anticipation that, as a married woman, Nancy will be able to afford a bungalow outside of town, a dream she pursues doggedly throughout the narrative. She imagines that, quote, once she married Jim, she wouldn't go on running the chip shop, although she plans that, quote, the idea of her giving up work would have to come from Jim. Her determination not to lose Jim to Eilis is thus as much conditioned by these financial ambitions as by any romantic ideal. The contrast between her imagined married life and the constrained reality she endures as a widow is configured pointedly. Quote, she wondered how she had ever tolerated the town, enclosed, watched over places. She looked toward the river and thought of all the cement and stone that made up the town, the hard surfaces and sharp angles. That was all she had known. She smiled at the idea that she would put the same energy into making a garden as she had into opening a fish and chip shop. It is no coincidence that Tóibín invokes not only the cultural mores of the town here, enclosed, watchful places, but also the very real material factors that condition Nancy's behavior. This awareness of her material condition is also emphasized by Nancy's insecurity about Eilis's perceived glamour and in her sensitivity about her own appearance. Quote, she believed she had chosen her best clothes for the day, but now in the sleek atmosphere in Brown Thomas, she was like a woman who did not normally come here. In panic, she smelled her cardigan for even the faintest whiff of fried food. Nancy's harnessing of the socio-cultural proclivities toward silence and the policing of women is thus just as much about her desire to reattain a certain social status as it is about that cultural milieu. Her recycling of her, quote, old engagement ring, a material marker of her status, as well as an unspoken sign of her claim to Jim, and her donning of what she calls her good shoes to announce her engagement, inextricably bind the financial ambitions and limitations she negotiates to the cultural context which she exploits. Now, in contrast, Jim has a life in Enniscorthy, with or without marriage, as inheritor of his parents' bar. As a result, he can look forward to a life with Nancy while simultaneously exploring life with Eilis with little material consequence. Quote, he looked forward to Nancy being there at the end of the day, and then he realized that there was no point in looking forward to this. It was precisely what he was ready to walk away from. Although Jim recognizes the illogic in what he is doing, quote, Jim realized that he himself was like one of his own worst customers, someone who knew what he should not do, but was driven to do it regardless. He is nonetheless seduced by the possibility of a second chance. Quote, how could he let this chance to be with Eilis slip by? Unlike Nancy or Eilis, however, Jim's opportunity for a second chance does not cause him to face any dire social or financial consequences for the decision he makes. While he may suffer regret, perhaps the gossip of Enniscorthy's repressive society, Jim will simply find a new job as a bartender in America, or he will continue with his planned marriage to Nancy. He does not have to endure the financial strictures that impact both women. In her review of Brooklyn, New York Times reviewer Alex Witchell memorably captured the dilemma confronting Eilis Lacey upon her return to Ireland. Quote, A central question for Eilis Lacey is, do you relinquish whatever identity you've built to collapse back into the warm embrace of family and small town that long ago defined you as so much less? And if that is what home means, is that where you want to be? Long Island tantalizingly reengages that question, but it does so with the long view of 20 years' experience as an emigre. And like its predecessor, Brooklyn, the novel interrogates what McWilliams describes as, quote, the female returnee's reluctance to return to, or the impossibility of staying in, Ireland. Although an American resident of 20 years, Eilis remains constrained by the same sociocultural repressive mores that restricted her life in Brooklyn. These same proclivities acculturate her love triangle with Nancy and Jim, setting the boundaries that ultimately doom her attempt at redemption. For Nancy, these constraints are limiting, but also empowering, as she is able to manipulate them to serve her larger goal. Yet Nancy and Eilis both illustrate a wider continuity that adheres between these two novels, and I would argue, arguably in the name of the game as well. Fiscally constrained respectively into emigration and by widowhood, Eilis and Nancy illustrate the additional pressures experienced by mid-century Irish women as marriage and financial limitations constrained their agency. In this respect, while our attention is most often drawn, understandably, to the sociocultural pressures toward silence and repression that Tóibín captures in both Brooklyn and Long Island, and honestly in all of his canon, the novel's greatest contribution may be their unrelenting portrayal of the ways in which women's autonomy was conditioned by the economic strictures that held them in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this interesting reading of, Long Island and also Brooklyn, I think. I was very intrigued with your, how you put it. We were reading the text, so we just started discussing Brooklyn as historical fiction and as a revision, especially, with regard to hegemonic history, bringing the perspective of women into, bringing it to the discourse of, 1950s and then in Long Island, 1970s something history. And I think it's interesting how Tóibín revises that, but then also shows us that, he gives voice to these women, but then again, he shows us how they are silenced and how they only have limited agency. But then on the other hand, I think with Nancy, and I hadn't really realized that, I think, until you told us how she instrumentalizes the gossip in the town in her favor. So again, there's interesting, power struggles and conflicts beneath the surface of both of the books, I think. And I do know that my students have prepared quite a number of questions along those lines, but also other questions. And I'd like to ask everyone, not just my students, everyone in the Zoom room to ask their questions. You can raise your artificial hand, or if your camera is on, or if you want to turn on your camera, you can just wave at us and ask your questions, please. Ms. Stangler, go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, do you think that the historical events in the book, so the immigration part and all that, how the historical parts in the book play a role, do you think that it's accurate or presented in a nuanced or historically accurate way?
I do think that the historical representation is very good. And Colm had actually come to give a lecture at my college at Moyne shortly after he'd written Brooklyn. And he talked about, this is so like him and so interesting. He talked about the scene with the stockings in Brooklyn and the research that he did into women's stockings. So he did a lot of he also knew nothing about American baseball, which was very funny. when he talked about that, because he had to do a lot of research apparently for the baseball scene with Tony and his brothers. But yeah, I mean, it's a known fact that women in particular were forced to move. One of the interesting things historically, right? One of the interesting things about Eilis is that she has a skill set that enables her not to become a domestic servant, which would have been the most common pathway for Irish women emigrating. So it's interesting because she does have that skill set, but it's also true of immigration in general. And I talk a little bit about this in the chapter in my book on Brooklyn. Immigrants do tend to move to communities of people who have immigrated from their home place. And one of the interesting things about Brooklyn is the sense of a bubble it creates, right? How the Eilis moves into this house with a woman who's presumptuous, but also starts trying to treat her like a daughter. And I don't think anyone has written that essay yet. So if any of you is ambitious, someone should talk a little bit about the role of motherhood in Brooklyn, because the contrast between her actual mother, who's a bit of a spitfire, and the parallel to the woman in the boarding house. But they create this sort of, very contained space, which is something he also talks about in another short story, the name eludes me, in Mothers and Sons. But those pressures are absolutely true. His representation of the transatlantic voyage apparently is pretty accurate. So he did a good deal of research on it. And what fascinated me about the move from Brooklyn to Long Island, novel-wise, is the consistency of voice. I didn't talk about this, but think about how hard it would be to revisit a character 15 years later, to age that character 20 years, and to still have it sound like Eilis, but also have her sound like she grew up some, right? So I know you didn't ask that, but I wanted to tack that on there. But yes, I think the historical representation is very accurate. And I think the aging of Eilis is actually quite remarkable.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we do have Annika Schmeer's question now. She asks, why did Colm Tóibín write kind of an open ending for both novels? We were discussing that a bit with regard to Brooklyn. Is it an open ending or not? So why did Colm Tóibín write kind of an open ending for both novels? And does this correlate with the theme of silence in the novels? So that's Annika Schmeer's question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will tell you, like, the ending of Long Island absolutely infuriated a fair number of people. The first time I read it, I thought it was a very brave ending, because I think the first time I read it as more empowering than I did the second time. And then the second time I read it, I realized I was disappointed because I disagreed with myself, which is never fun. I disagreed with my own first reading, but also I think I've been accused on occasion of being hopelessly optimistic, and I suppose I might be guilty of that, but I had wanted it to be more empowering than I think ultimately it proves to be. However, we do know her brother offered her money for a new house. We do know that she now has options. We do know that Eilis has been extremely consistent and clear that she will not go back to Tony if that baby is in her house. So why? I almost feel like in Brooklyn, it was more about how hopelessly incapable Eilis was of making decisions. And she frustrated the hell out of me forgive me for swearing, your delicate ears. Heck, she frustrated the heck out of me for that in that novel. But I think in some ways it goes to, and I am going to answer your question, I promise. I think in some ways it goes to how intentionally he paralleled the two novels, right? So on the one hand, he couldn't have ended the text conclusively, given the fact that he was making the decision to show how pervasive and consistent these cultural proclivities are, right? You don't morph into an American with American mores, whatever the heck that means, especially in this day and time. You don't morph into that as if it were a unitary thing when you've grown up in that culture in Enniscorthy your whole life. Can you adapt? Can you acclimate? Can you become sort of a, heterogeneous mishmash? Of course, that's what culture is, right? But it's also portable and you carry that with you, right? So it's a long-winded way, but I hope not a frustrating way of saying, I think he did it, to parallel the two texts, and to reinforce the fact that these texts are bound together. That's why I called them a dual or dueling relation of place, but also the text's imbrication with one another. And it's because Tóibín is dedicated to the idea that you can't evade your history, but you can adapt to it. And that's a mistake I think that people made, critics of Tóibín made for the first 7-10 years of reading his work, is they read him in a very unambiguous way, right? Like the Heather Blazing was read as, oh, this ending is so depressing. No, it's not. Eamon Redmond adapts. He picks up his son, whereas his own father didn't pick him up. But does that mean he now is like Mr. Emotionally Available? Of course not, because we are who we are, and we don't, whatever Thoreau or Emerson said about you don't have to be the same person every minute or every hour. Most of us are, right? You can adapt, but you're not going to have a complete personality transplant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much. I also think that when I was reading Long Island, I thought he cannot get out of that mix up in any way that would make sense. And I was dreading the fact that while reading it, I knew there would not be a conclusive ending to the
Yeah.
novel. But I think it makes a lot of sense to look at the parallels between the two texts and then also the differences. And what I think is, I would argue that he stresses Eilish's position, Eilish's liminal position at the end of both novels. She's
Yeah.
in between.
Yes.
The open
Yeah.
ending expresses that most strongly, I
Oh,
think.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting because a lot of people have read, refer to Long Island as a sequel. Tóibín resists that a little bit, which is interesting. I don't know why he does. I mean, it's clearly in conversation with Brooklyn, and he knows that, right? But he had never intended to revisit this novel. And it just kind of brought him back. Apparently, I'm not speaking for him. This is what he said in interviews and such. The other thing that's interesting, and this is not something I talked about here, it's in footnotes, but it's not here. A lot of the reviewers have noted that the Brooklyn that Eilish lives in, well, the Long Island that Eilish lives in is uncannily similar to Enniscorthy, right? There's a lot of gossip, there's a lot of silences. I think that's true, but you can only push that so far, right? Because the wider family, and this is one critique that's sometimes made of both texts, is that it stereotypes the Italian Americans a little bit. This, again, not my argument, but one that's been made. But they're very boisterous and loud and engaged. And I've had students who very much identify with that representation, or so they tell me. So I wouldn't say it's the same, but to your point, Eilish is very much on the outskirts of that family, right? I mean, that moment when she says to her father-in-law, I'm as American as you are, is so striking because he's treating her like she's not really American, which is such a sad commentary, especially right now in America, right? But the fact that she says, you don't count, he says, you don't count, basically, goes to the fact that she's never fully been absorbed into that family. Now, is that because Eilish is Eilish? Is it because Eilish came from Enniscorthy? Did she just get a bad draw in the in-law lottery? I don't know, right? But it's certainly consistent with that positioning that you're referring to. And I think it goes to the fact that she's always been a character on the outskirts, even when she's assertive, right? Now, I mean, not with her children, though. And that's something too. It's a counterbalance, but that's one of the ways that his characters are so human, you know?
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? I know you have more questions. Yeah, Ms. Friedrich, go ahead, and then Ms. Brüggemann. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you think that Eilish has an hybrid identity? Because, as you already said, she does not really feel at home in both Ireland and the US. So, does she really have an Irish identity and an American identity, or is she just kind of lost in between those two?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the challenge of immigration, right? Like, I mean, one of the things, one of the lines that I mentioned, and I'll reiterate it here because it reinforces and goes to your point. She says, Enniscorthy townspeople didn't have to have different voices they used in different settings, right? So there's American Eilish and there's Irish Eilish, and she's torn between the two. And I think the narrative's use of home goes exactly to your point. So great question, right? She has a home when she's in Ireland. She's like, I wish I weren't home. When she's in Long Island, home means Ireland. When she's in Ireland, home means Long Island, right? So there's a duplicating effect, right? Or a schism, right? Which your professor referred to as an in-betweenness. You are caught in these cultural polarities. And she's considered an outsider in both. Her father-in-law says, you're not really American. Jim says she's an outsider. Maybe she'd understand me. So yeah, you never can really go home again, right? If any of you has ever moved from one place to another, or if you've gone away to school and then go back to your house feels different when you come back because you've now lived somewhere else. Or if you go revisit a house you moved out of, it's yours, but it's not yours anymore. And that's the uncanny element of it. And that's the uncanny that's coming into play for Eilish. And I mentioned ghosting. That's something that Tóibín toys with a lot. It's in some of his short stories. It's definitely in Brooklyn. It's in Long Island. It's the idea, if you think about what a ghost is, it's a trace, right? It's there and it's not there. It was there, but now it's not, but it's back again. And he uses that as a metaphor to capture that sense of uncanny presence and absence, right? You're culturally present, but you also aren't there anymore. So you struggle with the tension between the two.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brüggemann, your question, please.
Yeah. So I kind of feel that it has already been answered. I'm not sure, but I'll ask anyway. So Eilish is kind of caught between two worlds, geographically and emotionally. And I would like to know what you think, to what extent her character can be interpreted as a representation of a female identity conflict between kind of self-determination and also family obligations.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I'll cite Tóibín first to answer your question. In an interview that he did, I think it was the one with America Magazine, he basically says the victor in the story is Mrs. Lacey. The character who comes out the happiest is Mrs. Lacey. And Mrs. Lacey hasn't aged well in terms of motherhood, right? Tóibín has referred to the mothers in his canon as, and I'm quoting him again, monsters, monstrous. He says, my mothers are monstrous. And you can almost hear him like rubbing his hands together and cackling with glee because he enjoys writing monstrous mothers. But often, as we saw in Nora Webster, it's because they are situated in a way that conditions them emotionally with limitations, right? Like Nora Webster's a terrible mother by some counts, but she's also human and she's just experienced a just devastating loss, right? Eilish is one of the best mothers in his canon, right? But she's also emotionally quite limited. But you can tell her kids love her, she loves her kids, right? So I think that, what complicates the portrait of Eilish in Long Island, which was not a complicating factor in Brooklyn, is her motherhood, the fact that she's a mother. And it's interesting to me that he finally drew a nice mother, right? So certainly, and I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but this is kind of how it makes sense to me. Yes, she has all that cultural in-betweenness. Yes, you cannot extricate the pressures on Eilish from her gender construction at that period of time, from the 50s through the 70s. And that, I think, again, is the main conditioning factor you see that sets Nancy and Eilish over here and Jim over here, right? Is Jim worried about people talking? Yes, he's sneaking around with Nancy too. Was he embarrassed when Eilish went back and the whole town was like, gossiping about it? Indeed, he certainly was. Did it hurt him in any way? No, it bruised his ego. He still has his parents' bar. If he decides to drop everything and move to America, fine, become a bartender. You're all good, right? So yes, I think gender is inextricably bound in the construction of the novel. And I think one of the things that, again, that's so interesting, Tóibín writes a lot about the limiting pressures on women. It's in the South, right? It's in Brooklyn. It's in Name of the Game. It's in Long Island. So he very much is interested in the way that those pressures are exerted on people who were particularly vulnerable to the Irish cultural imaginary. Does that make sense? Thanks for the
Yes,
question.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, Ms. Becker, go ahead.
I'll also just turn quickly the video on. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk, first of all.
You're welcome.
Well, first of all, a comment about Mrs. Lacey, because she kind of had a really great redemption arc in Long Island for me anyways, because at the end she's like, I'll come with you and I'll clear up the situation with the baby. And I was like, yes, family, a mother.
Yes.
I'm interested in Long Island versus Brooklyn as places, because I've read a lot about Brooklyn being Enniscorthy for Eilish when she gets there first, because of the Irish there and the parish and like all of the Irishness there, I guess.
Yeah.
I remember reading Long Island and being like, oh, she's now in Italian places.
Yeah.
And then there's her place of work where there's other immigrants. I forgot where they're from. I'm sorry. But very much not Irish at all. And then you said earlier, oh, Long Island has been compared to Enniscorthy. So I'm really interested to how that works.
Yeah.
That's not really a great question, like phrasing wise, but sorry.
No, that's a great question, and fair play to you. That's a smart question and makes a lot of sense to me. I think partly that's one of the reasons why I balk at the suggestion that, Long Island is just as oppressive as Enniscorthy. Not really. Partly not really, because we're only seeing the family compound, right? So to say, oh, Long Island is just like Enniscorthy, you ignore the other, I don't know how many people would be living in Long Island in 1970s, many people who are there, and you suggest that the Fiorello family counts for all of Long Island. So that's the first reason that I sort of say, not really. Now, is it true that there are pervasive silences in that family? Yeah, maybe, but I don't consider those silences in the same way. To me, those are secrets, and secrets are not the same as silences, right? A silence means that you want to say something and you can't in the Enniscorthy context because you're culturally prohibited or self-repressed. You're, used to just internalizing. It's more about secrets and who's in and who's out in Long Island, right? So the Fiorello family, they sound like they're talking up a storm. They don't seem to be having much repression within the nuclear family. It's just that Eilish is on the outskirts. She's liminal, right? So I don't see those as directly parallel. Now, when it comes to, so yes, it's a great question. When it comes to Mrs. Lacey, I mean, she's kind of delicious as a character, and what's delicious about her, partly sometimes it's just the mean streak, like the mean streak that he draws. I cut some of the quotes out about Mrs. Lacey, but she says to her daughter at one point, I wasn't sitting here waiting for you to come home and put everything to right. I would have been waiting a long time. I mean, she's just digging at Eilish until Eilish finally flees, remember, and goes to stay with her brother. She just can't take it anymore, right? But she's a character who's interesting, and she's one of two. No, there are more. There are many widows in his canon, and that's a whole nother conversation to have. But, you know, is it a question of her age that she just doesn't care anymore? That she's just like, fine, I'm just going to say what I actually think? Is she angry at her daughter for leaving? Clearly. Has her daughter deprived her of certain cultural bonuses, like being able to show off her grandchildren? Yes, which is one of the reasons why she marches Larry and Rosella all around the town to show them off, right? So, but I agree. I'm digressing slightly because I also enjoy Mrs. Lacey very much. It's not exactly a parallel. And I think, again, it's a slippage and maybe a failure to understand the difference in some of the reviews in the papers between cultural silences and secrets, and those are not the same. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Sure.
But what I think, you know, Eilish comes back twice, once in Brooklyn, once in Long Island, and she does so in moments of crisis. You know, in Brooklyn, she comes back because her sister has died. And in Long Island, she comes back because she's been betrayed by Tony and she's in a situation where she doesn't know what to do. And she just, you know, leaves. And it's not, she's not coming back for her mother specifically. And I think this might also play into, I mean, there were 20 years when she could have come back to, you know, see her mother.
Yes.
Who's also, you know, we do know that there's two more brothers who are in England, and there's this one brother who's left with her. So she's not exactly, you know, surrounded by a large family as the Fiorellos are, who really stick together in Long Island. Apart from Frank, I think, who's also an outsider. So I think maybe I was thinking maybe Mrs. Lacey has a point in being a bit, you know, snobbish or feeling a grudge against Eilish, at least at the start. And then I was wondering, you know, at one point she accepts the appliances and let the craftsman set them up only to say, you know, I'll leave and I'll never come back to this house.
Right.
So it's also, you know, quite interesting. And I think she's a fascinating character, and she's probably a character who's a lot more complex than her daughter is, interestingly.
Well, keep in mind too, though, that and this goes, I think, to Ms. Becca's point. She has sons, as you said, but the sons are not. She's not bitter against the sons. She doesn't hold a grudge against the sons, who both, you know, emigrated. One came back, but still, she doesn't hold a grudge against them, and kind of lets the sons off the hook a bit. And even in Brooklyn, the sons write to Eilish and say, you need to go home. Not us, you. We're in England. You're all the way over in America and have to come back by boat, but you're the one who has to go home. So there is a gendered element. And when she accepts the, sorry about the light, morning light is coming in now. When she accepts the cooker and the, you know, washer and whatnot, she claims she bought them. She says, oh, I purchased these recently. So she doesn't even give her daughter credit, right? So, but you're quite right. I mean, if you've seen the movie version of Brooklyn, I think the way that, I hate the ending of the movie version, Brooklyn, by the way, but because it completely undermines the ambiguity. And I know adaptations are not obliged to be faithful to the original, and that's fine, but I didn't like the interpretation because that does give Eilish a personality transplant. Right, where she stands up and she announces, I'm Mrs. Fiorello. No, she would never do that. She went back because she was forced back, and we all know it, right? But I lost my point. Oh, the ending of that film makes Mrs. Lacey just a wounded kind of tearful character, but she was mad. She was like really mad when Eilish went back, to the point that she wouldn't even say goodbye to her and then doesn't see her for 20 years. And I think the insinuation is she's held a grudge for all that time. However, she is also fiercely independent in some ways, right? She knows how to navigate the town. She doesn't want the gossip. I hope you don't hear the lawnmower. Someone's decided to mow their lawn. Okay, good. And yeah, so I just find her really, really interesting too. But I do think that it goes partly to the gendered expectations. She feels betrayed by Eilish specifically because she's her daughter who left.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, when Eilish is, sent off to the US by her mother and Rose, and I think it's mainly Rose who decides for her to, go to America.
Yeah.
At one point, Eilish thinks about that and then says, Rose sacrificed herself for me. She decided she would stay at home and she would care for mother.
Yeah.
And once Rose is dead, of course, her brothers and maybe also Mrs. Lacey herself expected her to stay at home, which she had herself made impossible by marrying Tony, I think.
Yeah, I mean, part
it all
of
goes back to that, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, part of what's so interesting about Rose, too, is where'd she come from, right? She's independent. She has a job. She's a fashion plate and goes out, golfs by herself, does what she wants. I mean, it's never explained how Rose came about, right? Coming out of that culture, which again goes to show that it's, although he often draws it as fairly unitary, he's not trying to make cartoonishly stereotypical representations, because he does allow for that variety. Frank is variable in the Fiorello family, right? And especially for the time. Although, the other thing about Long Island is some have argued it really kind of ruins Tony. Like, I never would have expected Tony to, well, A, to cheat on Eilish, but also to succumb to his family so easily and readily, like the patriarchal sort of structure of the family. That didn't make sense to me in terms of who I thought I knew Tony to be as a character. But, people change over time. And again, we only see so much of Tony. We only see him during that kind of romantic dating period, right? So maybe he too just fleshes out as a character in a different way.
Yeah. Although I must say, I was never a fan of Tony's in the first place.
Because of the blackmail?
I'm sorry?
Because of the blackmailing her to come back to him?
Yeah. And also he never, all throughout the courtship, I think he never asked what she wanted.
Yeah.
It was all about what he wanted.
Yeah.
And so maybe it makes a lot of sense that it turns out the way it turns out in Long Island.
Yeah, it does make you want to go. It makes me want to go back and reread Brooklyn, see if I had read him wrong, like if what I missed. That would, because especially when you see how consistent as a voice Eilish is, and Tóibín sees no inconsistency because he's gotten some pushback. Again, I'm referring to interviews he's done. He's like, look, things happen, cheating happens, and he's like, I haven't made him a monster. He's just a flawed human. So
Okay, yeah. Any more questions? I know you do have more questions, people. You've prepared them. So go ahead, ask them. Yeah, Ms. Stoiber, go ahead.
Yes, it's a bit of on another topic, but for me, I thought it was really interesting how Eilish's and Nancy's relationship or their friendship in Long Island is represented, because in Brooklyn it's said they were best friends when growing up, and of course Eilish left for America, but when she then returned for the second time, for me it was almost like immediately that Nancy considered her a competition. So it wasn't really any trace of friendship or growing up as best friends left. So for me that was really interesting, and I just wanted to ask your opinion on why maybe that was, because later there is this kind of competition over Jim. It kind of develops to that, but in the beginning of the novel, for me, it was a bit strange how it was like this immediate thought by Nancy to go there. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes back to the idea of you can't go home again, right? A lot of their friendship becomes performative. They haven't seen each other in 20 years. The implication seems to be they haven't really stayed in touch, right? Even just letters back and forth. So having her back would be an uncanny echo of someone who used to be really important to you and who is now back. And so you have that history together, but you've also got a 20-year gap. Then you've also got the respective financial pressures on both of them, which puts them in competition for the same man. One of the things, again, that I didn't mention, but I talk about in a longer version of this, is that when Eilis finds out that Jim is engaged to Nancy, her question to him is, how is it that you are engaged to the person who was my best friend? And that is kind of symptomatic of the fact that although Eilis and Jim have been playing out this, it's a bit of a fantasy, right? I mean, one is engaged to someone else, one is married with 2 children who, as Jim, ruefully notes, are not just going to disappear. He says, there will be no children for Eilis and me. So as much as they're kind of playing out the possibility of a do-over, you can't undo the history of what's occurred, right? And her question about who was my best friend, when the engagement goes public, they kind of see the writing on the wall, if I can use a cliche. And she acknowledges, okay, she was my best friend, but she's not really her friend anymore in that sense. And I think that's what you're picking up, right? It goes back to that idea of uncanniness. When you've been somewhere and you're not there anymore and you go back, it's not the same place. I forget that it's Desserteau. Michel Desserteau talks about the difference between place and space, right? And a space, I'm trying to remember which one is which. A space is a location. No, a place is a location. A space is an inhabited place. So if you've ever moved into a new place, a new apartment, a new room, a dorm, and you walk in there, or even a campus, the first time you walked on Würzburg's campus, right? You were like, I don't know this place yet. By the time you graduate, that place is like yours. You own it. You know every inch of it. And you inhabit that place differently, right? So it really goes back to that idea of the way you inhabit a space. And Eilis's relationship to place is different now. And it's inflected by the cultural determinants and by history and by distance. And that inflects her friendship with Nancy too. Great question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, then I think we can call it a day for us. Over where you are, Kate, the day's only just starting. So thank you very much again for, first of all, your lecture, your reading of the texts, and then also for being so kind to answer our questions about the 2 books, which was very insightful for us, and we'll continue the discussion next week then.
Yeah, they were great questions. Thank you all for your time and attention, and thanks again for the invitation. I really enjoyed getting to speak to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you so much. See you all soon on one or the other events or occasions. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.